possibly one of the most famous Canadians in the world right now. No, not Justin Bieber or Justin Trudeau. It's the academic Jordan Peterson.
The past 2 years, the Canadian psychologist and academic has been adopted as a hero.
Are you a radical right-winger?
It's a silly question. What's the evidence for that?
I'm not asking for it. I'm asking you.
It's ridiculous to defend yourself against an accusation that has no grounds.
So what is your political perspective?
I don't really have a political perspective. I'm not trying to play a political game. And I don't think that the problem that we're having right now is a political problem. I think it's deeper than that, which is what I said right from the beginning, which is why I think that what I'm doing is resonating.
Stephen's teammate is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, a YouTube sensation, and the author of the big new international bestseller, 12 Rules for Life. Ladies and gentlemen, Toronto's Jordan Peterson.
So how did he become so well known? He first came to national prominence in Canada in 2016 in a debate about new laws on gender identity. Bill C-16 made it an offence to refuse to call someone by their chosen gender pronoun. You say you've been painted as an extreme right-winger.
No, some people have tried that. Not very successfully, but they've tried it.
And you came to prominence in part over your opposition to this law that we just talked about in Canada, proposing the use of preferred pronouns for transgender people. Just for clarity.
Mandating them.
Yeah.
Right.
Saying that you should do it.
No,
but,
that you had to do it.
Right, you had to do it by law, but just...
Hundreds of thousands subscribe to his online lectures.
And his videos where he talks everything from identity politics, which we've touched on, to the Bible, to Disney movies, have been viewed over 150 million times.
And then finally, there's also, and I don't know what you think about this with regards to evidence, but what constitutes evidence is not always that easy to determine, even in the scientific domain. So think about how we think about ourselves and other people and how we treat ourselves and other people. You could imagine that you're like a clock running down, and that's like a deterministic model, but people aren't clocks. We're dissipative structures. A clock is something that runs downhill. We're not clocks by any stretch of the imagination, and we take energy in and we disperse energy, and so what we see in front of us is an array of potential universes, and those are the universes that we could bring about as a consequence of our actions, and we make choices to the right or the left. There's a lot of mythological speculation about that sort of idea too, in an ethical sense, because we decide what sort of reality that we want to bring into being, and so we encounter potential like God did at the beginning of time when he made order out of chaos. Chaos is this chaotic potential. We confront chaotic potential with our consciousness and we cast that into reality.
In a way, you're appealing to a certain political viewpoint.
Well, that's what people claim.
That's your fans. Your fan base seems to come from that side.
No, I don't agree with that at all. I think that, first of all, whether or not what I have are fans is debatable. Rock stars have fans. I'm not a performance artist. I don't have fans. I have people who are listening carefully to what I'm saying. And it's very complicated what I'm saying. So they're not just fans. It isn't men precisely who I'm speaking to. It's people. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm actually interested in individuals, and I'm interested in their fortification against tragedy. Every time I do an interview, the interview is always political. It's always political.
Well, the clue is in the title of this program. We are the Daily Politics.
No, fair enough. No, look, fair enough. And I'm not casting aspersions at this program, but the fundamental news that's important about what I'm doing isn't the political element. If you treat yourself like you're a free moral agent with choice and that you can determine the course of your life, then you seem to get along better with yourself and to be less anxious and to be more productive. And if you treat other people like that they're free agents that are making voluntary choices about how reality is going to come into being, and you reward them when they do it properly and you punish them or otherwise discipline them when they do it badly, then your relationships with them seem to work. And then if we predicate our society on the presupposition that each individual human being is capable of doing just that, then we seem to have extremely functional societies. And this is something that Sam Harris has been taken to task for many times, is if you dispense with the idea of free will, how is it you organize your relationship to yourself your interactions with your family and your relationships with the broader social community. It's a very complicated issue. So I believe strongly that we have free will, that we're responsible for our choices. Those choices are constrained in many, many ways. So there's a chaos within that can manifest itself, that can disrupt whatever order you are. And you know that in minor ways, because everybody's always running around doing things that aren't good for them, that they know they shouldn't do and that they can't control. And so there's a chaotic and an orderly aspect to everything, to the individual, to the family, to the social world, to the natural world. It's chaos and order at every level of analysis simultaneously.
Thank you for your support for more and better debate on the big issues of the day. It's great to have you as virtual participants in tonight's proceedings. Great start to the debate, Michelle. Thank you. I'm now going to ask Jordan Peterson to speak for the con team.
So we should first decide what we're talking about. We're not talking about my views of political correctness, despite what you might have inferred from the last speaker's comments. This is how it looks to me. We essentially need something approximating a low-resolution grand narrative to unite us. And we need a narrative to unite us because otherwise we don't have peace. What's playing out in the universities and in broader society right now is a debate between two fundamental low-resolution narratives, neither of which can be completely accurate because they can't encompass all the details. Obviously, human beings have an individual element and a collective element, a group element, let's say.
Force for good or bad, PC?
Well, I think at the moment it's clearly a force for bad. I think it's corrupted the universities, perhaps beyond repair. And I think the reason for that fundamentally is that the PC ideologue types think that the proper way to classify people is by their group affiliation. And there's all sorts of problems with that. One is that there's an endless number of ways that you can classify people by their group affiliation.
Jordan, let's have you jump in on this idea of what you see as the pernicious danger of groupthink when it comes to ethnicity, when it comes to gender. Why do you think that's one of the primal sins, in your view, of quote, political correctness?
Well, I think it's one of the primal sins of identity politics players on the left and the right, just to be clear about that. Personally, since this has got personal at times, I'm no fan of the identitarian right. I think that anybody who plays a game, a conceptual game where group identity comes first and foremost, risks an exacerbation of tribalism. It doesn't matter whether it's on the left or the right. With regards to the idea of group rights, the idea of group rights is extraordinarily problematic because the obverse of the coin of individual rights is individual responsibilities. And you can hold an individual responsible, and an individual can be responsible. And so that's partly why individuals have rights. But groups, how do you hold a group responsible?
But I hear a lot of category creep in, again, the argument against political correctness or against seeking group redress, the idea that kind of that way lies dehumanization, or, you know, that you're kind of 1 minute you're asking...
Let's have Stephen come in on this, because this is part of your opening remarks. You're a category creep, Stephen. Respond to that.
It's a nice... I'm still very lost about why we aren't talking about political correctness. We're talking about politics, and that's fine. And I share exactly what you think about it. I'm not an enemy of identity politics per se. I can obviously see where it goes wrong and where it's annoying. Let's be empirical about this. How well is it working for you in America at the moment? Well, not well at all. Really isn't.
Right.
You can answer me in a moment. The reason that Trump and Brexit in Britain and all kinds of nativists all over Europe are succeeding is not the triumph of the right, it's the catastrophic failure of the left. It's our fault. We absolutely... My point is not that I've turned to the right or anything like that, or that I'm nice and fluffy and want everybody to be decent. I'm saying political correctness. Resist. Fight. If you have a point of view, fight it in the proper manner, using democracy as it should be, not channels of education, not language. You know, it's so silly. There's a chess rule, you know. In chess, the best move to play in chess is not the best chess move, it's the move your opponent least wants you to play. At the moment, you're being recruiting sergeants for the right. By annoying and upsetting, and instead of fighting, either fighting or persuading. I've been given huge grief already simply because I'm standing here next to Professor Peterson, which is the very reason that I am standing here in the first place. I'm standing next to someone with whom I have, differences, shall we say, in terms of politics and all kinds of other things, precisely because I think all this has got to stop. This rage, resentment, hostility, intolerance, above all this with us or against us, certainty. A grand canyon has opened up in our world. The fissure, the crack, grows wider every day. Neither on each side can hear a word that the other shrieks, and nor do they want to.
I think one of the things I loved about Jordan's book, which I speed read last night, so forgive me, Jordan, I've not read every line. But one of my favourite rules in Jordan's book is Rule 9, which says, assume the person you are listening to might know something you don't.
Chaos is something that you say is distinctly feminine, whereas order is something
it's symbolized by the feminine, yeah.
Okay, so you posit that. So this almost seems like, in certain ways, an antidote to femininity. Is that not the case?
It's an attempt. I think that. Let me think here for a minute how to put that properly. Under other political conditions, it could have been an antidote to order. But I think that the fundamental threats that our society faces now are threats from the side of chaos, from the side of destabilization, rather than, in our culture at least, rather than from the side of tyranny. If you read Maps of Meaning, there's a section on neuropsychology that's also buttressed by a book written by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary that lays out the relationship between the right and left hemisphere. Now, it's quite strange that we have a right and left hemisphere. It's almost as if we have two consciousnesses dwelling in our being. And they're quite separable. If you cut the corpus callosum that unites the two, then the two hemispheres will act independently to some degree. You can communicate with each of them somewhat independently. So they actually view the world quite differently. And that hemispheric distinction is not only there in human beings, but also in animals, a long way down the phylogenetic chain. And so you're wired so that you're not just order, and you're not just chaos. You're order, continually confronting chaos so that the order remains updated. See, something is meaningful. The reason that something is meaningful is because you're getting a deep instinctual signal that you're encountering anomaly at a rate that doesn't exceed your capability. That's also the rate at which you can keep yourself updated optimally. And so meaning isn't epiphenomenal, and it isn't some kind of delusion that rationality can and should overcome to say, well, everything's meaningless. It's like, no, it's not. Meaning is the most fundamental instinct for adaptation. And so that's partly why in 12 Rules for Life, I said one of the rules, I think it's Rule 7, is do what is meaningful, not what is expedient.
Michael, give us your rebuttal.
Let me step out here in Peterson land. I feel freer already. I don't know what mythological collective Mr. Peterson refers to. I'm part of the left. They're cantankerous. When they have a firing squad, it's usually in a semicircle. Part of the skepticism of rationality was predicated upon the Enlightenment Project, which says we're no longer going to be subordinate to skepticism, to superstition. We're going to think, and we're going to think well. I'm going to stand here at the podium. I'm a preacher. And I will ask for an offering at the end of my presentation. This is the swimsuit competition of the intellectual beauty pageant. So let me show you the curves of my thought. Oh my God, was that a politically incorrect statement I just made? How did we get to the point where the hijacking of the discourse on political correctness has become a kind of Manichaean distinction between us and them? And I ain't seen nobody be a bigger snowflake than white men who complain. Mommy, they won't let us play and have everything we used to have under the old regime where we were right racists and supremacists and dominant and patriarchs and hated gays and lesbians and transsexuals. That, yeah, you got to share. This ain't your world, this everybody's world. And let me end by saying this. You remember that story from David Foster Wallace? Fish are going down, two fish are going, and an older fish comes in the opposite direction. He said, hello boys, how's the water? They swim on, they turn to each other, what the hell is water? Because when you're in it, you don't know it. When you're dominant, you don't know it. Nothing, Kaiser Soze said, is more interesting that the devil did than to make people believe he didn't exist. That's what white supremacy is.
The phenomena of meaning is a manifestation of the complex orienting reflex. You're the force that confronts chaos and transforms it into habitable order. And there's an idea that if you do that using truthful speech, it's probably the deepest idea in the Bible. If you confront chaos and the unknown using truthful speech, then the order that you produce is good. The left hemisphere is specialized for what's known, and the right hemisphere is specialized for anomaly. And V.S. Ramachandran, who's a famous neurologist, an MD in California, has also made a very similar claim based on his analysis of brain-damaged individuals. But Goldberg's case was the left hemisphere is specialized for what you know how to do, and the right hemisphere is specialized for response to what's unknown. And that maps onto this order-chaos dimension, that the right hemisphere is concerned with reaction to anomaly. And so what happens in some sense is something unexpected happens, that's the domain of chaos. And that stops you in your tracks, it freezes you, and that's a predator response, a prey response actually. You're frozen. The unknown has manifested itself. You're not in order anymore. So you freeze, and then you cautiously start to explore, and then it's imagistic. You start making imaginal representations, metaphoric representations, dramatic representations of what might constitute the unknown. And then those representations are practiced and implemented in the world, and they become more and more fine-grained and automatized. And as that happens, the locale that they're represented in the brain shifts from right to left. So the reason I'm telling you all this is because, you know, this is where the metaphysical and the physical unite, and this is the sort of argument that I was trying to make to Sam Harris, and hopefully we'll be able to continue doing that because I'm going to meet him 3 times in the next few months. So that the yin-yang idea, the chaos-order idea, is metaphorical in some sense. To say that the world is made up of order and chaos doesn't sound like an empirical statement, but strangely enough, the world to which our brains are adapted is actually the world of chaos and order. You can think about it as unexplored and explored territory too. That's another, you know, take on it. The 2 different modes of looking at the world are necessary for survival, right? So that's real. And so the idea that the world is made out of chaos and order is perhaps the most real idea.
The fundamental low-resolution grand narrative that we've oriented ourselves around in the West is one of the sovereignty of the individual, and it's predicated on the idea that all things considered, the best way for me to interact with someone else is individual to individual, and to react to that person as if they're both part of the process, because that's the right way of thinking about it, the psychological process by which things we don't understand can yet be explored, and by things that aren't properly organized in our society can be yet set right. The reason we're valuable as individuals, both with regards to our rights and responsibilities, is because that's our essential purpose, and that's our nobility, and that's our function.
One of the lines in the New Testament that I've tripped over many times is Christ is being anointed with a very costly vial of perfume, and his disciples are taking the woman who does that to task for wasting money that could have been spent on the poor. It's a very complicated story, but Christ tells his disciples that the poor will be with us always. And that's something that I've spent a lot of time trying to understand why that statement would be made. That, and to those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken, which is a discussion, which is a very, very succinct observation about the continuing existence of inequality. So there's evidence throughout the New Testament of observation of the inevitability of inequality. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a moral good.
Men are having a lot of crises at the moment in terms of mental health, suicide issues, their own sense of identity, because I think some of the stereotypes put on men are quite limiting for them as well. I think they make men quite unhappy as well.
The devil's in the details with regards to equality, because I'm an advocate of equality of opportunity. But
and
I think the idea outcomes, that's an appalling doctrine.
Why?
All right. Well,
because you have to produce an unbelievably potent bureaucracy to make the ever greater and ever finer distinctions that are necessary to enforce equality of outcome. How many group differences are you going to equalize across? Is it just gender and sex? How many genders?
No, so
gender and ethnicity? How many genders?
I think
how many ethnicities? How many races?
Last year, he supported ex-Google employee James Damore, who had been fired for suggesting men and women have different interests due to biological differences.
You see, one of the things that's happened in the analysis of the differences between men and women is that the social constructionist claim is that the differences are socially constructed, right? Is that it's a consequence of environment that men and women differ. But what the scientific literature indicates is that as cultures become more egalitarian, like they have in Scandinavia, the differences between men and women actually increase rather than decreasing, which is a direct repost to the social constructionist view. So they just deny all that.
Your side spoke, so I'm going to go to Jordan, then to you,
Let's
Michelle.
assume for a moment that I've benefited from my white privilege. Okay, so let's assume that. That's fine.
Assumption.
That's what you would say. So, so let's say, here, let's get precise about this, okay?
Was that very individual of you?
Let's get precise about this, okay?
Let's get precise.
To what degree is my present level of attainment or achievement a consequence of my white privilege? And I don't mean sort of. I mean, do you mean 5%? Do you mean 15%? Do you mean 25%? Do you mean 75%? And what do you propose I do about it? How about a tax? How about a tax that's like specialized for me so that I can account for my privilege, so that I can stop hearing about it? Now, let's get precise about one other thing, okay? We'll get precise about one other thing. Now,
Precise?
Yeah, precise, yes. And so, if we can agree, and we haven't, that the left can go too far, which it clearly can, then how would my worthy opponents precisely define when the left that they stand for has gone too far? You didn't like equity, equality of outcome. I think that's a great marker. But if you have a better suggestion and won't sidestep the question, so let's figure out how I can dispense with my white privilege, and so that you can tell me when the left has gone too far, since they clearly can. And that's what this debate is about political correctness. It's about the left going too far. And I think it's gone too far in many ways. And I'd like to figure out exactly how and when, so the reasonable left could make its ascendance again and we could quit all this nonsense.
Jordan's point about how does he, in a sense, get an equal voice in this debate back if it is implied that his participation brings with it this baggage of white privilege that doesn't allow him to see clearly the issues that are before us.
But that is to be complicit in the very problem itself terminologically. You're beginning at a point that's already productive and controversial. You're saying, how can he get his equality back? Who are you talking about? Jordan Peterson? Trending #1 on Twitter? Jordan Peterson? With an international bestseller? I want him to tweet something out about me in my book. Jordan Peterson, right? This is what I'm saying to you. Why the rage, bruh? You're doing well, but you're a mean, mad white man, and you're going to get us right. And I have never seen so much whine and snowflaking. So I don't think Jordan Peterson is suffering from anything except an exaggerated sense of entitlement and resentment, and his own privilege is invisible to him, and it's manifest with lethal intensity and ferocity right here on stage.
Jordan, I'm going to have to let you respond to that
as you live. Well, what I derive from that series of rebuttals, let's say, is twofold. The first is that saying that the radical left goes too far when they engage in violence is not a sufficient response by any stretch of the imagination, because there are sets of ideas in radical leftist thinking that led to the catastrophes of the 20th century, and that was at the level of idea, not at the level of violent action. It's a very straightforward thing to say you're against violence. It's like being against poverty. It's like, you know, generically speaking, decent people are against poverty and violence. It doesn't address the issue in the least. And with regards to my privilege or lack thereof, I mean, I'm not making the case that I haven't had advantages in my life and disadvantages in my life like most people. You don't know anything about my background or where I came from, and it doesn't matter to you because fundamentally I'm a mean white man. That's a hell of a thing to say in a debate. I'm going to point out two things again. The first is that my question about when the left goes too far still hasn't been answered. And then the second thing I'm going to point out is that, you know, it's conceivable that I am a mean man. You know, I mean, maybe I'm meaner than some people and not as mean as others. I think that's probably more the case. But I would say the fact that race got dragged into that particular comment is a better exemplar of what the hell I think is wrong with the politically correct left than anything else that could have possibly happened.
Or explains your opposition to this idea of a law mandating you to use a preferred pronoun is because you don't actually believe that that's the truth, that a trans woman is a woman and therefore you can't use that pronoun.
No, that's not my argument at
Really?
all. Yeah, really. My argument is that the government shouldn't compel voluntary speech.
No, but I know what your argument is, and
No,
you've
but
made
that's
it very
really
clearly.
it. No, but that's exactly it. There's
But the
no behind-
motivation
there's no
behind
motivation
it.
behind it.
But you don't believe
I
a
wouldn't
trans
put
woman is a woman.
everything on my online in my life to take the stance I did unless I had thought that through very deeply. And I've thought it through very deeply. There aren't hidden motivations that have to do with some arbitrary prejudice against trans people.
Okay.
It's pure and simply this. There's never been a time in English common law history where the government compelled speech, and the Canadian government dared to do that. And that was unacceptable. And they masked it with this show of compassion for the oppressed, and I don't buy it.
Well, I'm going to go here. No, it's interesting to hear that there really doesn't seem to be a problem, but yet I think we all instinctively know that there is some kind of a problem. There isn't censorship. Of course not in the way that there is in Russia. But that's not why I came to this debate. I was interested in what I've always been interested in, the suppression of language and thought, the closing down, the rationalist idea that seems beguiling, that if you limit people's language, it may somehow teach them a different way of thinking, something that would have delighted the inventors of George Orwell's Newspeak, for example. And it seems to me it's just implausible. It doesn't work.
This feeling of being silenced, which I understand, although it seems very vague, right? You kind of are not quite putting your finger on who is silencing you, except for a vague fear that if you say something untoward, you're going to be the subject of, I'm not
Shaming,
sure.
yes.
Shaming, but by
shamed.
who?
Yeah.
But by what? By
I'm
the
not
internet?
gonna say their names. That's
No,
the
but I
whole
mean-
point. I'm scared. I
You're-
wouldn't.
but
If
you're
I'm
scared.
listed,
But
that's
again,
the point.
You're scared.
It is a culture of
right.
fear.
I understand there's that element
Yeah.
of fear. What I'm saying is that it's a feeling. It's a feeling that is this sort of intangible result of I think
Come on,
primarily.
we've all seen the sort of show trial thing where the person then apologizes. I have so much to learn about sexual politics. I am really sorry. Signed a lawyer, crossed out the name of the person. It's. You think the real mistake of our left is that we underestimate the right. The right isn't as stupid as we'd like them to be. If only they were. If only they weren't so cunning, so sly, so smart, so aware of our shortcomings. And I just fear that political correctness is a weapon that they value. That the more we tell the world how people should be treated, how language should be treated, what words are acceptable, what attitudes are acceptable, what HR meeting is going to tell you in a long bullet-pointed list about how you look at people. All of this is meat and drink to bad people, to malefactors, to bad actors. I'm not counting myself as one of those bad actors in that sense. I mean bad actors in the other sense.
Right.
I think I'd just really say that the ghost hovering over me it's a letter Oscar Wilde wrote, and he said to Bosie, his love, he said, the fact that you didn't get a degree is nothing, but you never acquired what is sometimes called the Oxford manner, and I'll say for that, the university manner. Oscar said, I take that to mean the ability to play gracefully with ideas. I think that's disappearing from our culture, and I think it's a terrible thing. But I don't think we should underestimate how much this feeling is prevalent in the culture of this strange paradox that the liberals are illiberal in their demand for liberality. They are exclusive in their demand for inclusivity. They are homogeneous in their demand for heterogeneity. They are somehow undiverse in their call for diversity. You can be diverse but not diverse in your opinions and in your language and in your behavior. And that's a terrible pity.
People don't think through what freedom of speech means because they tend to think it means the right to criticize those who are in power, for example, which is one of the things it means. But freedom of speech actually means the freedom to formulate ideas badly and awkwardly in public while you're trying to think them through.
Including offending people?
Well, it's inevitable that you're going to offend people if you're going to talk about anything difficult, because if you talk about something difficult, then people are going to become emotionally involved. And that's especially true if you talk to large numbers of people about something difficult. Like if I address an audience of 1,000 people about anything vaguely contentious, which is obviously something that needs to be thought about, then a small percentage of them are going to be offended. And so what that means is that as your audience scales, or as the importance of the topic increases, your ability to say anything decreases. That's not good.
And that's part of this pernicious politically correct doctrine that I've been speaking about. When a hierarchy becomes corrupt, then the only way to ascend it is to exercise power. That's essentially the definition of a tyranny. But that doesn't mean that the imperfect hierarchies that we have constructed in our relatively free countries, which at least tilt somewhat towards competence and ability, as evidenced by the staggering achievements of civilization that we've managed to produce, it doesn't mean that the appropriate way of diagnosing them is to assume without reservation unidimensionally that they're all about power, and as a consequence everyone who occupies any position within them is a tyrant or a tyrant in the making. And that is certainly the fundamental claim of someone like Foucault. And it's part and parcel of this, what would you call it, this ideological catastrophe that's political correctness. I'm not here to argue against progress. I'm not here to argue against equality of opportunity. Anyone with any sense understands that even if you're selfish, you're best served by allowing yourself access to the multiplicitous talents of everyone, and to discriminate against them for arbitrary reasons unrelated to their competences. It's abhorrent. That has nothing to do with the issue at hand. There's no way I'm going to agree that political correctness is the way to address any of that, and there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, some of which I would say was displayed quite clearly tonight.
Look, when you look at the world, you look at the world with a set of presuppositions. I outlined that in chapter 10 in 12 Rules for Life, called Be Precise in Your Speech. It indicates that when you look at the world, you look at it through a value structure. You can't help that because you're always aiming at something in the world, and you're always aiming at something you want, and you're trying to get it. And so that means that you look at the world through a value structure. Now the question is whether or not that value structure is valid. And that's a very complicated question. Okay, so how do you know if it's valid? Number one, you lay it out and you act it out. You implement it perceptually and then you act it out. And if you get what you wanted, what the theory predicted, that's another way of thinking about it, but wanted is a better way of thinking about it, then the fact that that behavioral routine and perceptual structure produced the intended result validates it as a tool for obtaining that result. And that's a form of truth. Now, it might be the only form of truth, although I'm not convinced of that completely, but it might be. It's a very complicated question. And so if you immerse yourself in meaning, you can learn to do that. You can learn to do that. You can make that goal your highest goal. And so then the highest goal would be to be the sort of mythological hero, let's say, to embody and incarnate and imitate the mythological hero, like the imitation of Christ, which is what you're called to do if you happen to be Christian. That means that you live in meaning, and that meaning is the antidote to the suffering of life that would otherwise make you brutal and vengeful and unhappy and miserable, and like that young guy who just mowed down 12 people in Toronto. These are real things. You lose your sense of meaning, you end up in hell. And in hell you do all sorts of terrible things. These are dreadful realities, and it isn't as if they're not grounded in the appropriate science.
So again, we're going to go right now to Stephen Fry and Jordan Peterson, get their thoughts on how the evening played out. Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you both. We're just going to do a quick discussion with the online audience who's watching right now, just to get your reactions to the debate. And maybe just start with you, Jordan. There were some heated moments here. Did that surprise you, that the exchanges that you had with Michael Eric Dyson?
Well, I wouldn't say it surprised me. Well, I suppose it probably did. It just didn't seem like a very good tactical move. And I stand by what I said. I don't see any reason at all that my racial identity needed to be dragged into the discussion, independent of my personality proclivity.
So what I'm saying to you is that I would invite you, in terms of the surrender of your privilege, to give you a specific response. Come with me to a Black Baptist church. Come with me to a historically black college. Come to me to an indigenous or First Nations community where we're able to engage in some of the lovely conversation, but also to listen and hear. And when I added race to that, I was talking about the historically evinced inability to acknowledge others' pains equally to the one that they are presently enduring. So, as a human being, I love you as my brother, but I stand by my comment.
Well, I've seen the sorts of things that you're talking about. I happen to be an honorary member of an indigenous family, so don't tell me about what I should go see with regards to oppression. You don't know anything about me.
You asked me a question, I gave you a response.
Yeah. You gave me a generic response, a generic race-based response.
Jordan Peterson, I would like for you to come with me, Michael Eric Dyson, to a Black Baptist church. You been to one of those?
I would be happy to do that, by the way.
Okay, all right, I'm going to hook you up.
I would say what I just said to Mr. Fry here is that it was a pleasure sharing the stage with him. I've rarely heard anyone ever deliver their convictions with such a remarkable sense of passion and wit and forbearance and erudition. It was really something.
I believe one of the greatest human failings is to prefer to be right than to be effective. And political correctness is always obsessed with how right it is without thinking of how effective it might be. But I'm not sure, and I would like this quotation from my hero Bertrand Russell to hover over the evening. One of the painful things about our time is that those who feel certainty are stupid, and those with any imagination and understanding are filled with doubt and indecision. Let doubt prevail. And I realize that that's not a political point of view, it is a personal one.
Right.
And the gap between the personal and the political, which is a space you're obviously very interested in as a psychologist, is one that is rarely explored. People are either so personal that it has no application in the outside world and the organization of human affairs, or they're so political and so much to do with structure and distinction between hierarchies and networks and so on, that they forget the individual. And that's the space in which the impassioned liberal lives, and it's not easy to do it because you often do sound rather wet, and I'm aware that I did. But I enjoyed it.
What should I say in closing? Get your act together. Much as you can. There's things to do in the world. And it would be good if everyone was out there doing them. We'll see how we could beat this old globe back into some reasonable shape, or into better shape than it's ever been. That would be a lovely thing to do. So, goodbye for now.